The hand holding the cloth was not a kitchen hand, not yet. The knuckles were slender, and the skin, though chapped from the lye soap in the scullery basin, had not yet thickened into the permanent hardened armor of a woman who spent her life over steam and iron. It moved in slow, deliberate circles, polishing a silver tray already gleaming under the single flickering gas lamp, the motion a quiet refusal to hurry for anyone. In the warped reflection, the face was a pale oval, a smudge of dark hair and the deep-set shadows of eyes that looked at nothing, because looking at the distorted image of herself was worse than looking at the damp stone walls. The sound of the ball was a low, rhythmic pulse that traveled through the floorboards, a muffled beat of violins and laughter from a world away, a world that existed just on the other side of a thick oak door but might as well have been across an ocean. She could feel the vibration in the soles of her thin shoes, a ghost of a waltz she was not meant to dance, and she kept polishing, circle after circle, because the simple repetitive motion was an anchor in the disorienting sea of noise and heat and the thick greasy smell of roasting meat that clung to the air. The silver was cold under her fingers, a stark contrast to the humid press of the kitchen, and each circular pass of the cloth was a tiny, silent rebellion, a way of imposing a small, perfect order on one single object when everything else was chaos. She would make this one thing perfect. She did not know what would happen after the tray was done, because no one had told her anything beyond the clipped instruction, a murmur of silk and disdain that had sent her down the winding servants' stairs, away from the glittering chandeliers and into this subterranean world of sweat and shouting. So she focused on the tray, on the smooth, cool metal and the satisfying glide of the soft linen, a task that required no thought, only motion, and in that motion there was a strange, hollow sort of peace. The music swelled, a crescendo of strings and piano that was sharp enough to pierce the stone, and for a moment the hand stopped its endless circling. She closed her eyes. It was just a sound. Outside, Silas felt the storm in his bones long before the first drop of rain fell. The air had gone heavy and still, smelling of dust and distant water, and the wind that had been whispering through the pines all afternoon had fallen silent, holding its breath. He stood by the paddock fence, his shoulder resting against the rough-hewn timber, his gaze fixed not on the grand manor house blazing with light, but on the bruised purple clouds massing over the western ridge. He knew that sky. He had seen it 100 times before, a prelude to the kind of violent cleansing rain that could turn the dusty tracks to mud and send horses skittish in their stalls. A carriage, the last of them, rattled up the long drive, its lamps swinging like captured stars, and from within came the sound of a woman's high-pitched laugh, thin and sharp in the waiting silence. Silas didn't turn. He preferred the company of the horses, their warm, honest smell, the soft nicker one of them gave him from the darkness of the stable. The world inside that house, the world of powdered wigs and stiff collars and words that meant 3 different things at once, was not his. He was the estate manager, a man who understood soil and seasons, the mending of a stone wall, the temperament of a nervous colt. He was a creature of tangible things, of calloused hands and steady competence, and the fragile, glittering performance inside felt as alien to him as a dream. He had been inside earlier, standing near the back of the great hall as instructed, a silent, watchful presence in his best dark coat, and he had seen her. Alara. The poor cousin, the forgotten ward, a quiet shadow drifting at the edges of the swirling color, her dress a simple gray against the vibrant silks of the other women. He had seen the way she held herself, a stillness in the midst of frantic motion, and the way her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, seemed to be memorizing the patterns on the wallpaper, the light on the floor, anything but the people. He had noticed her for weeks, a ghost in the hallways, always with a book, always with her head slightly bowed, as if to make herself smaller. Now he thought of her in there, in that room of predators and prey, and a familiar low ache settled in his chest. The first drop of rain, fat and cold, struck his cheek. It was starting. He had seen it happen. Not all of it, but enough. He had been making his way along the gallery that overlooked the main hall, checking a loose shutter that had been rattling in the rising wind, when he'd seen Julian corner her by the tall potted ferns. Julian, the heir, with his perfectly coiffed hair and the casual, cruel smile he reserved for those he considered beneath him. Silas had stopped, his hand resting on the window latch, his body half hidden in the shadows. He could not hear the words, only the tone, Julian's, a low, confident murmur, hers, so quiet it was absorbed by the ferns themselves. He saw the way Julian's hand went to her arm, a gesture of ownership, not of affection, and the way her entire body went rigid, a statue carved from ice. She did not pull away. She simply froze, her chin lifting just a fraction, a small, almost imperceptible act of defiance that Julian, in his arrogance, likely did not even notice. But Silas noticed. He saw the flicker of something hard and unbending in her eyes before she lowered them again. Julian laughed then, a soft, unpleasant sound, and released her, turning on his heel and melting back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Silas had stayed in the shadows for a long moment after, watching Alara stand perfectly still, her hands clasped so tightly at her waist that her knuckles were white. She took one slow, deep breath and then another, before she turned and walked away, her movements precise and controlled, betraying nothing. It was later, downstairs, that he saw the final quiet act of dismissal. Lady Anya, Julian's mother, had glided over to Alara, a vision in emerald silk, her smile a perfect painted curve that did not reach her cold, assessing eyes. She had murmured something, her fan fluttering delicately, and then gestured with a flick of her wrist toward the servants' corridor. There was no scene, no raised voices, just a quiet, surgical excision. He watched Alara's face, saw the brief, sharp intake of breath, the flash of humiliation that she quickly masked with a blank, polite neutrality. She inclined her head, a simple nod. Then she turned and walked toward the corridor, her back straight, her head held high, and disappeared through the door that separated the light from the dark. She did not look back. The storm broke with a sudden, violent crack of thunder that rattled the window panes and made the crystal goblets tremble. A collective gasp went through the ballroom, followed by nervous laughter as the heavens opened up and rain began to lash against the glass. Silas stood near the great hearth, the heat of the fire, a welcome contrast to the growing chill in the room and the colder chill in his gut. He watched Julian, now holding court near the musicians, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was with his friends, a pack of young men with the same bored, predatory look in their eyes. They were laughing, their heads close together, and Julian was talking, his gestures expansive. Silas couldn't hear the words over the music and the drumming of the rain, but he didn't need to. He could read the scene as easily as he could read the weather. He saw one of the young men pull a small leather pouch from his coat, saw him count out a few coins onto his palm. A bet. Julian's eyes flickered for a moment toward the servants' corridor, the same one Alara had disappeared through, and then he smiled that slow, confident smile again, and nodded, accepting the wager. It was all transactional. A woman's dignity, a piece in a game, a few coins on a Tuesday night. Silas felt a slow, hot anger begin to build inside him, a pressure behind his ribs that was as real as the storm pressing against the house. He looked around the room, at the dancing couples, at the smiling faces, at the glittering jewels and the facade of civility, and it all seemed grotesque, a lie painted over something rotten. These people, with their fine manners and their casual cruelty, they were the real savages. He thought of Alara's face, that brief, unguarded flash of pain, and the way she had straightened her shoulders and walked away, carrying her humiliation like a shield. Not here. He would not stand here and watch this happen, not tonight. The decision was not a thought, but a physical impulse, a current that ran through him and straightened his own spine. He set his untouched glass down on a nearby table with a quiet click. He turned his back on the fire, on the music, on the whole glittering, hollow spectacle. He began to walk. His path was a reversal of hers, a deliberate journey from the front of the house to the back, from the world of performance to the world of work. He bypassed the main staircase, with its polished banister and ancestral portraits, and took the narrow, winding servants' stairs he knew so well, his boots making a soft, rhythmic sound on the worn stone steps. The air grew warmer, thicker, the delicate scent of perfume and wax replaced by the honest, earthy smells of baking bread, simmering stock, and human sweat. The muffled pulse of the waltz faded behind him, replaced by a new symphony. The clang of iron pots, the sharp chop of a cleaver against a wooden block, the hiss of water on a hot stove, and a cacophony of voices, sharp and stressed and urgent. This was the engine room of the great house, the hot, beating heart that powered the effortless elegance of the ballroom, and it was a world away. He emerged into a long, vaulted corridor, its stone walls slick with condensation. A young boy carrying a heavy tray of empty glasses scurried past him, his eyes wide, careful not to make contact with a man who so clearly did not belong here. Silas nodded to him, a gesture the boy was too frightened to return. He moved deeper into the labyrinth, his steps sure and steady. He knew these passages. He had walked them countless times, overseeing repairs, checking on supplies, a familiar and respected figure to the permanent staff. But tonight, he was an intruder, his dark coat and stern expression marking him as an emissary from that other world. He saw the kitchen staff glance at him, their movements faltering for a second before they turned back to their tasks, their faces carefully blank. They knew better than to ask questions. He approached the cook, a large, florid woman with sweat beading on her upper lip, who was screaming at a potboy about the state of the gravy. She fell silent as Silas stopped before her, wiping her hands on her stained apron. "Sir," she said, her voice dropping to a respectful murmur. "I am looking for the young lady," Silas said, his own voice low and even. "The cousin, Miss Alara." The cook's eyes flickered with something, pity perhaps, or just weary resignation. She knew the story. Of course she did. Nothing happened in this house that the Kitchens didn't know about first. She gestured with her chin toward a low, arched doorway at the far end of the chaotic room. "Scullery," she said, and turned back to her gravy. He had his answer. The scullery was a small, damp, forgotten space, little more than a stone closet tucked behind the main kitchens. The air was thick with the metallic smell of soap and the sour scent of discarded food, and the only light came from a single sputtering candle that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. He found her there, her back to the door, bent over a massive copper pot that was almost as big as she was. She was not crying. Her shoulders were not slumped into feet. She was scrubbing, her movements rhythmic and forceful, her entire focus narrowed to the blackened bottom of the pot. The sound of her work, the scrape of the brush against the metal, was the only sound in the small room, a steady, determined counterpoint to the distant, fading music of the ball. For a long moment, he simply stood in the doorway and watched. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the fierce concentration in the set of her jaw. She was not polishing silver now. She was scouring, fighting, channeling all her anger and humiliation into this one brutal physical task. She was trying to scrub the stain away, not just from the pot, but from herself. He knew then that they had misjudged her completely. They saw a quiet, plain, disposable girl. They did not see the iron in her spine. He took a step into the room, and the sound of his boot on the stone floor made her start. She spun around, the brush still clutched in her hand like a weapon, her eyes wide and startled in the candlelight. She looked from his face to his clean, dry coat, a man from another world standing in her place of exile, and a flush of new shame colored her cheeks. She thought he had come to mock her or to deliver another command. He saw the thought in her eyes, and it made the anger in his own chest burn hotter. He said nothing. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. He held it out to her. Her eyes darted from his face to the offering in his hand, her expression wary, confused. He unwrapped it. It was a piece of bread still warm from the ovens and a thick slice of cheese, a simple meal, a kindness. He held it out to her again, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was rough but steady. "You should eat," he said. It was not a request. She stared at the bread and cheese as if she had never seen food before, her mind struggling to make sense of this quiet, impossible gesture. He was the estate manager, a man of silence and authority, a figure who moved with purpose along the edges of her world, but had never once crossed into it. To see him here, in this damp, forgotten corner, holding out a piece of bread, was so fundamentally jarring that it broke through the rigid control she had wrapped around herself. Her eyes lifted from the food to his face, really looking at him for the first time. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the quiet intensity of his gaze. There was no pity in his expression, only a kind of stark, elemental anger on her behalf. It was a solidarity she had never known, a silent, shared acknowledgement of the injustice. That recognition, more than the cruelty of the ball, was what finally threatened to undo her. Her throat tightened, and for a horrible second, she thought she might actually weep. She fought it down, swallowing hard, her knuckles white where she still gripped the scrubbing brush. He did not move, did not rush her, simply stood there, patient as stone, holding out the simple offering. It was a choice. She could refuse, retreat back into the protective shell of her pride, or she could accept this small, unexpected tether to another human being. Slowly, as if her arm weighed 1,000 pounds, she reached out and took the bread from his hand. Her cold, damp fingers brushed against his, and the brief contact was like a spark in the chilled air. She did not say thank you. The words felt too small, too hollow for the magnitude of the moment. She just held the bread, its warmth seeping into her skin, and met his eyes. "They sent you," she said, her voice a low whisper, almost an accusation. It wasn't a question. He shook his head once, a small, sharp movement. "No," he said, and the word was flat, final. "They did not." He took a small step closer, and the candlelight caught the hard planes of his face. He looked past her, at the monstrous copper pot, at the damp stone walls, at the whole miserable little scene of her punishment. "This is not your place," he said. It was a simple statement of fact, a truth so plain and so powerful it seemed to resonate in the very stones around them. "This is not your place." He was not just talking about the scullery. He was talking about the entire house, the entire world of casual cruelty and calculated slights. He was telling her that he saw her, the real her, not the poor relation, not the object of a rich man's bet, but the person who deserved better. And in that moment, something inside her that had been frozen for a very long time began to thaw. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the scrubbing brush from her unresisting fingers. He set it down on the edge of the stone basin with a quiet thud. The gesture was final, an ending. He was ending this. "Come," he said, and it was not a command but an invitation. He turned without waiting to see if she would follow, trusting that she would, and walked out of the scullery, back into the noise and heat of the main kitchen. She hesitated for only a heartbeat, her eyes on the discarded brush, and then she followed him, leaving the half-scrubbed pot behind her. The kitchen staff fell silent as they passed, a river of motion parting before them. Whispers followed in their wake, eyes wide with astonishment and speculation. The stern estate manager walking through the heart of their domain with the disgraced cousin trailing in his wake. It was a story that would be told and retold for years to come. Silas paid them no mind. His focus was singular, his path direct. He did not lead her back up the servants' stairs toward the ballroom. Instead, he led her down a different corridor, one that was darker and cooler, a passage that led to the storerooms and beyond them to a small, heavy oak door bolted from the inside. The rain was a frantic drumming sound against the wood. He slid the heavy iron bolt back, the sound loud and definitive in the quiet passageway. Then he pulled the door open. A blast of cold, clean, rain-scoured air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and pine and freedom. It washed over them, clearing away the lingering stench of grease and soap and humiliation. Outside, the night was a wild, dark canvas, lashed with silver sheets of rain, the manicured gardens of the estate dissolving into a churning elemental world. The distant lights of the manor seemed small and fragile against the vast, indifferent darkness. He stepped out into the downpour without hesitation, turning to look at her, his dark hair already plastered to his head, his face illuminated by the light spilling from the open doorway. He held out his hand to her, the same hand that had offered her bread. It was an offer of a different kind now, an escape. She stood on the threshold, the warm, suffocating world of the house behind her, and the cold, wild, uncertain world of the storm before her. She looked at his outstretched hand, then at his steady, waiting eyes. She thought of Julian's smile, of Lady Anya's dismissive gesture, of the endless circular motion of polishing silver. She thought of the cold weight of their judgment, and then she thought of a simple piece of bread, offered in the dark. She took his hand, her fingers laced with his, a firm, sure grip, and together they stepped out into the rain. Days later, the world was washed clean, the sky a pale, fragile blue after the storm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp soil and the sharp, clean fragrance of the pine forests that bordered the estate. Far below, in the valley, the great manor house was a distant, ornamental thing, a dollhouse belonging to someone else's life. Here, on the high meadow that belonged to Silas's small private holding, the world felt real and solid. Alara knelt in the rich, dark earth of a small, newly tilled garden patch, her hands, no longer soft, pressing seedlings into the soil. Her plain gray dress was smudged with dirt, and a stray strand of dark hair had escaped its braid to stick to her cheek. She was planting herbs, rosemary, thyme, lavender, her movements careful and precise, her focus absolute. There was a quiet competence in the way she worked, a deep instinctual knowledge of the living things in her care. This was a different kind of order than the one she had imposed on the silver tray, not a sterile, polished perfection, but a living, breathing one. A few yards away, Silas was mending a stretch of stone wall that had been damaged by the storm. He worked with the same steady, unhurried rhythm she did, lifting each stone, testing its weight and shape, fitting it into place with a quiet grunt of effort. The sound of his hammer striking the chisel was a sharp, percussive beat, a steady rhythm that underscored the peaceful silence of the meadow. They did not speak much. There was no need. A comfortable, quiet understanding had grown between them, a language of shared tasks and mutual respect. He had brought her here, to the small stone cottage that came with his position, a place that was his alone, separate from the grand house. He had offered her a room, a share of the work, a chance to be useful in a way that mattered, a chance to be seen. She had accepted. She had traded a life of gilded irrelevance for one of earthly purpose, and she had never felt more herself. He finished setting a large capstone, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He straightened up, his eyes finding her in the garden. She looked up at the same moment, as if feeling his gaze, and for a second, their eyes met across the space that separated them. A small, tentative smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her smile. He did not smile back, but he gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough, it was a promise. The world was quiet here, the air was clean. They had work to do. Afternoon. The sun was warm on his back as he split firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comforting, familiar sound. He worked steadily, his movements economical and powerful, his mind quiet. He no longer thought about the ball, about the faces in the crowd, about Julian or his mother. They had faded, become part of a distant, unpleasant memory, like a fever dream that loses its power in the light of day. His world had contracted to this small patch of land, to the stone cottage, the growing garden, the mended wall, and the quiet presence of the woman who now lived within it. He had spent a long time afterward wondering why he had done it. It had been an impulse, a defiance of an order he had long despised but had never actively challenged. He was not a man given to grand gestures. He was a man of practicalities, of ledgers and crop rotations. But seeing her in that scullery, with that scrubbing brush in her hand, her dignity a flickering candle in a suffocating room, had ignited something in him, a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. It was not pity, it was respect. He had seen her strength, and he had simply acted to place her in a world where that strength would be valued, not punished. He had offered her a sanctuary, and in doing so, had inadvertently built one for himself. Her presence had filled the quiet spaces of his life, not with noise, but with a shared sense of purpose. He found himself looking forward to the simple ritual of their evening meals, the way she would talk about the herbs she was cultivating, her voice soft but animated with a passion he had never heard before. He learned that she knew the old names for the wildflowers that grew in the meadow, that she could identify birds by their song, that she could draw with a startling, precise talent, sketching the patterns of leaves and frost on scraps of paper. She was slowly, carefully unfurling, revealing a person of substance and depth who had been hidden away for years. He paused in his work, leaning on the handle of the axe, and looked toward the cottage. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. She was inside, likely baking bread, the warm, yeasty smell a welcome promise on the afternoon air. He had gone looking for her in the dark, and what he had found was a light. It was a small light, a quiet one, but it was enough to navigate by. It was more than enough. He picked up the axe and went back to work. That night, a chill had settled over the high meadows, and a fire crackled in the small stone hearth of the cottage, casting a warm, dancing glow over the room. The simple meal was finished, the plates cleared away. Silas sat in his worn armchair, cleaning a piece of horse tackle, the leather creaking softly in his hands as he worked oil into it. Alara sat at the small wooden table, a piece of charcoal in her hand, a rough sheet of paper before her. She was drawing, her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the soft curve of her cheek. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of charcoal on paper, and the soft rubbing of leather. It was a peaceful domestic scene, the kind of quiet Silas had always craved, but had never believed he would find. He finished with the bridle, setting it aside, and let his hands rest on his knees. He watched her, the way her brow furrowed slightly as she studied her work, the small, unconscious movements of her lips as she concentrated. He wondered what she was drawing. He had never asked to see her work, feeling it would be an intrusion into the private world she was so carefully rebuilding. She looked up then, as if sensing his stillness, and her eyes met his across the room. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, no wariness. There was a quiet strength, a self-possession that had been there all along, but was now free to surface. She turned the paper around on the table so he could see. It was not the herbs or the flowers he had expected. It was a drawing of his hands, just his hands resting on the arm of the chair, rendered with astonishing detail, the calluses, the lines, the strength in them. She had captured not just their shape, but their character. They were the hands of a man who worked, who built, who mended. The hands of a man who had pulled a heavy bolt and opened a door into the rain. He stared at the drawing, a strange tightness in his throat. No one had ever seen him with such clarity. No one had ever taken the time to look. He lifted his gaze from the paper back to her face. She was watching him, her expression open, waiting. He could not find the words to tell her what the drawing meant, what her presence meant, what that night in the storm had come to mean. So he simply nodded, once, a gesture of profound, unspoken acknowledgement. She gave him that same small, tentative smile from the garden, but this time it was fuller, more certain. It reached her eyes, and in the quiet fire-lit room, surrounded by the vast, dark silence of the mountains, it was a kind of grace. Weeks turned into months, and the green of summer deepened and then gave way to the gold and rust of autumn. The garden Alara had planted yielded its bounty, and the scent of drying herbs filled the small cottage. The rhythms of their life settled into a comfortable, predictable pattern, a quiet dance of shared labor and mutual reliance. The great house in the valley became a story they no longer told, a place that had no bearing on the solid reality of their world. They were two solitary people who had, by chance or by choice, found a way to be solitary together. They had built a life from the ground up, a life measured not in social standing or glittering parties, but in stacks of firewood, jars of preserves, and the slow, steady mending of a stone wall. It was a small life, perhaps, but it was an honest one. It was their own. One afternoon, a rider came up the track from the main estate, a young boy with a message. Lady Anya requested Silas's presence, a matter of accounts. He went, leaving Alara tending the fire, and walked back into the world he had left behind. The great house seemed smaller, somehow, less imposing. The opulence felt cold, the silence of the grand hallways oppressive. He met with Lady Anya in a small, suffocating parlor. She was polite, her words precise, her eyes cold as ever. She did not mention Alara. It was as if she had never existed. As he was leaving, he passed Julian in the hall. The young man stopped, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by a faint, contemptuous sneer. "Still playing the shepherd with your lost lamb?" Julian asked, his voice a low, mocking drawl. Silas stopped and turned to face him fully. He did not feel the hot anger he had felt that night at the ball. He felt nothing at all. He simply looked at Julian, his gaze steady and clear, and saw him for what he was, a small, hollow man, propped up by a name and a fortune he had not earned. He saw the weakness behind the arrogance, the emptiness behind the sneer. Silas said nothing. He simply held Julian's gaze for a long, silent moment, and in that silence, Julian was the first to look away. Silas turned and walked out of the house, back into the clean, open air, and did not look back. He walked up the track toward the high meadow, toward the curl of smoke rising from the chimney, toward the life he had chosen, toward home. He was no one's shepherd, and she was no one's lamb. They were just two people who had found their own ground and were strong enough to hold it. There is a quiet strength in seeing a person for who they truly are, not for who the world says they should be. It's a strength that doesn't require a sword or a crown, but a willingness to walk away from the noise and the lights and to step into the dark to find someone who has been left behind. It's the courage to offer a simple kindness in a world full of casual cruelty, and to recognize that a person's worth is not measured by their station, but by the resilience of their spirit. We've all felt overlooked at times, dismissed or misjudged, and we've all had moments where we could have been the one to see, the one to act, the one to offer that small, crucial gesture of respect. Thank you for spending this time with us, for walking through the storm with Silas and Alara. If their story of quiet dignity resonated with you, we hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that explore the strength of the human heart. And we'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. When was a time a small act of kindness made all the difference to you? Until next time, be well and look for the light in others.